Hello, my name's Adam Spring, and this is a remotely interested podcast. In fact, it's the first remotely interested podcast. I'm joined by my producer, Trevor Biondich. Trevor, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Adam, especially for our first.
Me too, and I'm quite excited to be here and doing it.
All right, now I have a quick question.
Fire away.
All right, why did you decide to start this podcast?
I decided to do this podcast because I want to look at the potential cross-pollination between technology-driven markets. I've been working in the high-end technology field for an extended period of time now, and the one thing I've noticed is people don't necessarily talk to each other in the way that you would expect them to, or communicate their stories to one another in how they're using technologies. So I've decided to do this to get people talking.
So who do we have for our first guest?
So our first guest is from Pixar Studios. He's worked on Ghostbusters II, he's worked on Robocop 2, he also worked on The Nightmare Before Christmas. And for about 15 years, he's been working with Pixar as a clay model maker of all of the characters that they feature in those films before they get digitized and put into computer software like RenderMan.
Oh, wow. Now, weren't you also saying that maybe our viewers don't know, but from our little talk beforehand, that he also has another job?
Yes, he does. He has a startup company called Paleo Mill with another member of Pixar Studios, and they 3D laser scan and 3D print dinosaur bones.
Well, that sounds interesting. I look forward to hearing what Greg has to say. Now, since this is our first podcast, maybe we should let the listeners know that we have a certain format that we are packaging our podcast in for them to actually consume.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the way it's going to work is we're going to have an open-ended interview, we're going to let it run, and we're going to split it into two parts. And then at the end of part 2, I'm going to ask Greg to have the listeners go away with 5 things that he thinks would be useful for them to learn about. That could be a website, it could be a book, it could be any source of information whatsoever. So without further ado, I present Greg Dykstra. Okay, my name is Adam Spring, and I'm here today with Greg Dykstra from Pixar Animation Studios. Hi Greg, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing, Adam?
I'm great, thank you very much. So, before we start, tell us a little bit about you and what you do at Pixar.
I am a character sculptor and designer. So I actually work in clay to help us figure out the designs of the characters. Sometimes this is happening. It starts with sketches. Usually there's drawings of some kind, and then it'll go to sculpture. It'll come to me, and I'll either be interpreting very rough ideas and helping develop the character, or I'll be working out the designs with more detail, with drawings that have more detail, and just kind of proving the design, making sure the director can see it, rotate it, touch it, do all kinds of things in a physical medium in real light. And then once we're happy with those designs, then that sculpt can be scanned and put in the computer, and either the data can be worked on directly, or it can be used as reference and modified as needed as we go through the process of figuring out how the thing will move, and we may need to make changes along the way.
Okay, that's fantastic. You kind of touched upon something I was going to actually talk to you about a little bit later on. But with regards from taking the physical object into the computer and I guess creating it either a digital mold or basically taking the parts of it that you want into the computer, what sort of scanning devices are you using? Are you using optical triangulation, or are you using things like Next Engine? What sort of things are you using to do that?
We've used a few different things over the years, but what we're doing mostly right now is structured light scanner that we have at Pixar, and so it's what we get is just a simple point cloud, and then that can be the software that we use can recognize that is a shape, and it can basically the modeler that's doing stuff has to, of course, come up with this version of it that is simplified, that it has far fewer points than the original scan. Those points also have to be organized with spans in between, and each one of those has to eventually have a control, or many of them have to have a control put on the AVARs, those points, and create a character that can be moved and that everything distorts correctly because that new mesh that they build.
Okay, that's fantastic. That's really interesting. with regards to the actual physical sculpture itself, obviously I'm assuming it's got wireframe and things like that. What were your influences sort of growing up to want to become a sculptor and things like that? Were you really into things like Ray Harryhausen and stuff like that? Or how did you get to where you kind of are now?
Yeah, definitely. Ray Harryhausen was a big part of it. I was always making drawings from my earliest childhood, and I was always a nature lover. There was always a number of memorable inspirations, though, that kind of collectively attracted me down my career path. The first thing I can remember, like being a real change in my approach to, or the way I felt about the world, was when I saw the original Planet of the Apes, which was in 1968. It was at a drive-in when I was 5, and it just blew me away. I remember knowing that those were regular people in ape makeup, and that somehow regular people had to have created the stuff I was seeing. And I knew it was their job, but I don't know if it really occurred to me that they were getting paid for it. I just know I wanted to make that kind of stuff myself. And as soon as I got home, I started, experimenting. I started trying to make my lips tight and rigid and kind of try to talk with the restrictions the actors had talked with. But then I discovered silly putty would actually stick to your skin for a while, so I made my own temporary ape makeup appliances. And I ran around the house imitating Cornelius. My brother Adam was soon joining in, and we were both acting like apes. But anyway, it seemed like that movie was a gateway for me to other movie apes like King Kong and Mighty Joe Young, which in turn ignited my love of monster movies of all kinds, of stop motion, Ray Harryhausen, monster makeup. And then there were dinosaurs. Also in 1968, it was a big year for me. I found my first fossil, a little trilobite. My dad and brothers and I were on a canoe trip, and when I found it, I was so puzzled. It looked like a pill bug, like a roly-poly, but it was made of stone. And my dad told me it was once alive millions of years ago. How he said how everything we were seeing then was completely different. It was an alien world with strange creatures and wondrous plants. And my imagination just exploded at that moment. I mean, honestly, it was like a physical sensation. And I could never go back after that. I could never be my old self. It lit a love of the prehistoric world that would be with me for the rest of my life. This excitement that has never died.
That's yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because like I can hear the enthusiasm through your sort of voice of like, yeah, you suddenly became aware of like it was a reality changing experience almost. And the thing I found interesting when I was actually sort of doing a little bit of research. I mean, obviously we've met before at Pixar and things like that, but when I was doing research for this, I didn't realize that you actually get sent out to, like, for instance, when you were doing things like Ratatouille, you'd actually get sent to Paris and sort of like go to the restaurants and see, how the reality of the actual worlds you're creating actually work. And I think that's really sort of fascinating that you get to sort of do that, because it's kind of I guess for you, it's kind of translating the everyday into this completely made up world, but that must be one of the most difficult things you can actually do.
Yeah, it is. A lot of times, our task is to, I mean, in caricaturing the world, we're looking for the things that, the information that is really important, in someone's face, or or even in like trying to distill what makes people. For me, it's mostly people in Paris look like a French population, and there actually are very subtle differences from country to country that you can see. If you're in Australia or if you're in France, the group of people you see as a whole might have some certain common traits you're not going to see quite the same in other countries. And so it's that kind of observation of the important details that make that work that we have to figure out what to exaggerate about any of the characters we're doing, whether they're human or not, and then what details have to kind of be suppressed, kind of simplified and made less important, so that ultimately what we get is kind of a highlighted version of those things. And that works even with completely made up characters like the monsters in Monsters Incorporated or something. And but yeah, it's Pixar has always, and I've always been very impressed about this, that they've always done lots of research for every film, and we dig up all kinds of stuff. We want to know the facts before we decide how to change those facts, because we do, to get the right impression, to get the right emotion that we want out of the film, and to help tell the story, we are going to make changes. For instance, we have fish that talk, in Nemo, so we have to decide, okay, well, how can we get them to convey emotion? How can we, get them to talk and react the way that we need them to, but do it in a way that, as much as we can, respects what they really look like, or how they really behave. So it's this balance of the human need to connect to these characters, and for these characters to perform, with all the research we've done and trying to be true to that.
Yeah.
So but we definitely want to know what we're cheating before we start cheating. We don't want to be just randomly producing this stuff without knowing the truth behind the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting for me because it seems as though that you've done, in terms of your career and in terms of, the technology arc with all of this. Because, I didn't realize that you worked on stuff like Ghostbusters 2, which for me was just sort of like, when I first met you, I would have been like just totally awestruck because basically Ghostbusters is such a big film for me as a child. But in terms of like the technologies that we used on that to where we are now, what are the biggest changes that you've noticed in terms of translating, I suppose the suspension of disbelief is where I'm coming at from this, is what do you think the biggest changes are with regards to the technology and creating that suspension of disbelief that you've just kind of described?
I think the kind of visual concepts have remained largely the same, but yeah, how the stuff that's possible to put on the screen, and the way you do it has changed a lot. And when I was doing movies like Ghostbusters 2 or Robocop 2 or any of those, the computer presence in that work was almost non-existent. The computers were much more used for bookkeeping, for instance, in film. Like if I was working in an effects shop, then much more for that than the actual effects. We would shoot. I did a lot of work related to the stop motion effects that we were doing. And like on Robocop 2, and we had these motion control systems that controlled the camera as well as would allow us to do some stuff with these stop motion puppet characters. And we had a little controller unit called a Tondro controller unit that was probably my biggest association with anything computer-like for many years, and that was just like not much more than a calculator with this little narrow screen that told you what codes you had just pressed and how to activate them. So when I came to Nightmare Before Christmas, we were starting to get a little bit more of the computer world in that, but really, again, it was very simplified stuff. It was more about like helping the timing on figuring out how we were going to do expression sculpts, how they were working, and we could look at one or two frames on a video toaster, we called it.
So you were Amiga users then?
I'm sorry?
You were an Amiga user then? Amiga was video toaster, wasn't it? Or video toaster was Amiga?
Yes, I believe so. I believe that's what it was. But it was, yeah, it was very simple stuff. And actually it was shortly after Nightmare Before Christmas. I'd had a great time, but it had been a few years since I started thinking about taking a break from film. And so there was this gap. I decided to quit film for about 5 years. And it was on Nightmare Before Christmas that I started meeting some of the people that would become future Pixar employees. Pixar was really just getting started on their first feature film. And a guy named Joe Ranft was the first guy to suggest to me that I start working at Pixar. But I didn't even really understand what Pixar was. I had no idea, and it was even harder for me to picture how I would fit into it, because everything they were doing was computer-based stuff. And they came to me a couple of times over those years to try to talk to me about working there. But let's see if I have.
So you were playing hard to get then, were you?
I'm sorry. What?
So
I was kind of playing hard to get. It's like I think it was around 1996. A guy named Bob Polly asked me to join. I think I just ran into him in Walnut Creek, California, and I turned him down. And the biggest problem was I just still couldn't see how it would fit in. I wasn't a computer guy. I didn't understand why they were asking me to come to Pixar. And it was in 1999, Joe Ranft again. He and I talked, and he wanted me to come along. And by this time, they'd put out 2 movies, A Bug's Life and Toy Story. And they were both great. And I just started thinking, well, obviously they think I could fit in. So maybe it'd be nice to work with this strange little studio with these first 2 movies that were great. And thanks to Joe, I interviewed. And it was the longest interview I'd ever had. It was 4 hours with 11 people.
Wow.
But even then, yeah. And even then, after they'd given me a tour of the place, I met with Ed Catmull. I'm sitting in his office. Ed Catmull is Pixar's president. And Ed's talking. He's this brilliant guy, but I was already feeling overwhelmed by what I had seen and heard. How was I ever going to learn how to do all this stuff is what I was thinking. So I interrupted Ed. I told him he shouldn't hire me, believe it or not. And he was confused. He asked me why I would say something like that. And I told him, I'm a computer idiot, really. I don't even know how to email, which was true at the time. And Ed, though, he was wonderful. He just relaxed and said, we will always need artists, and we can teach you the other stuff. So now it's been 14 years with Pixar, and it's really been the best job I've ever had.
Yeah, I mean, that's just for people who don't know who Ed Catmull is, he pretty much created a lot of basically what's computer graphics today. In fact, I think his hand was actually the first ever computer generated thing for Future World, wasn't it, in the 1970s? Yeah, that's
true. He's our president now, and this Pixar was always his dream. I mean, back in the 70s, he almost immediately started thinking about he would love for the computer stuff that he was designing to somehow be applied to film someday. And he held on to that dream, all of this time. And he kind of made Pixar what it is. He kind of formed Pixar. This is, this is a manifestation of Ed's imagination from so long ago. And it did work. I mean, it took a lot. We needed, if John Lasseter hadn't come along, if Steve Jobs hadn't come along, this might not have never happened. But it was this perfect combination of ingredients that came together over the years and eventually got Pixar started. But yeah, Ed already had been pioneering the field of computer graphics and moving computer graphics.
So from the moment you sort of started at Pixar to sort of now, how has your sort of role evolved over the years? Because I imagine it must have done just by the way everything has changed, and obviously the way Pixar revolutionized really how filmmaking and certainly animation was sort of being done. So how has your role evolved over the years?
When I first started, I think my job was a lot like what I did on Nightmare Before Christmas, and it was specifically to get these characters designed and realized in 3 dimensions, but and that was Finding Nemo that was my first Pixar film. And then immediately after that, in fact, they were kind of overlapping. I started working on The Incredibles, and it was during The Incredibles that the first this first evolution maybe started happening with my job. The Incredibles was the first time Pixar. I mean, we'd had humans in our films before, but it was the first time that Pixar had a film that was based on humans, that there were they weren't background characters anymore. They were the main cast, and to do that was going to be a challenge. We needed to make them look really good, and Brad Bird, the director, had some very specific ideas. Tony Fucilli, Teddy Newton, Lou Romano, these are all guys in the art department that wanted this stuff to go forward. And actually, I was heading upstairs at one point and met Ed. We happened to run into each other, and he was just telling me, Ed Catmull, And he just was telling me that one of the things we really needed to work out was how we could get sculpts of expressions, these extremes of the expressions that the face would make for these characters. We had to work that out. We had never really had anything that was very reliable that way. And so it kind of rested on my shoulders, along with other people in the art department, to try to figure out how we could get that to work. Because it's one thing to come up with a digital version of a bust of, say, Bob from The Incredibles, but to make that face have a full acting range that looks good with every expression and that feels like Bob, it feels consistent with his personality and consistent with his relaxed form. It's actually a lot of work, and you have to really be conscientious of how you create every form within his face. What happens to his nose? How does the wrinkle that goes down his cheek to the corner of his mouth, how does that behave when it goes up? If he's got dimples in the side of his cheek, do they disappear? Do they stretch? The angles of his chin, the way his eyebrows work, the way they wrinkle between the nose, all of that stuff not only had to be figured out individually, like we created like 5 expressions for Bob, and they kind of became standards that we used here for a long time. And one was called squash, one was called stretch. Both of those just basically are the face as scrunched up as it can be, and as wide open as it can be, and so it represents 2 extremes on this continuum. But then we also, there's variations on that, and we needed to know, what did a smile look like? What did an open mouth grin look like?
Well, I would like to quickly ask, does that mean that you guys took a lot of pictures of actors or anyone coming into the studio and just kind of as many smiles and scrunched up faces as possible that you were kind of going for, and then mapping out those?
We did do the research actually on Incredibles. I think it was more, we hadn't, at the time that we were doing those designs, we still didn't know who was going to do Bob's voice. We were figuring that stuff out, and we do often refer to whatever actor is going to be doing the voice, but more often than not, it's that actually happens too late in the process, and we've already designed the character, but and maybe they're already built and articulated or rigged. That's when the controls are put into the digital model. But it's still, those actors can still influence basically the design, because as the animators who are the ones moving this stuff, making those characters act, they can refer to those actors that are playing the part, and if there's cool little things that they do, they're very distinctive to them, that might make its way into the character, especially stuff that they're doing during the performance, because we do videotape the actors while they're doing their voice recordings, and so whatever little thing they might do during that time might make its way into the final animation. But for Bob, for instance, we actually just used each other largely. We had the original designs that Tony Fucilli and Teddy Newton and Lou had all worked out, and then my original sculptures from that. But then we had to, in addition to the face, we had to start figuring out what we were going to do with their muscles. This is a movie that not only had normal humans, but they had humans in tight, costumes. Yeah. So everything was going to be shown off. And so we had to, I remember Tony Fucilli and I got into one of the offices and just started discussing anatomy and how biomechanics works, and how we could basically caricature that, just like we do the designs for a character's basic form, and so we would flex our forearm and decide, this can be represented with just one shape, but it's really important it deforms this way when the hand comes up, and so on and so forth. And we just kind of went through the human body that way, and we did take pictures of people, and we did a lot more of that on Ratatouille. But we do a lot with just people around the studio, and luckily Pixar's population was continuing to get bigger and bigger, and so we had a lot of people to choose from. And we still do that today. If we're looking for a particular kind of person, we'll see if there's someone at Pixar that can fit that kind of description, and we'll study the way they move and behave and look.
Yeah, I mean, it must be.
But
really...
yeah,
sorry, Karen.
Oh no, please go ahead.
I mean, it must be really, from sort of like a modeling reality point of view, the subtle nuances of things, it must really sort of change the way you view things. Like, for instance, I can imagine like textures of fabrics and things like that, and human hair and things like that. It must be really interesting to view it from such a different perspective of the things we take for granted every day. Is like you have to go into it into vivid detail and understand the behavior of it. It must be interesting.
Yes.
I would also want to ask, when you're animating these, do you think of, I'm going to start with the skeleton of my character and then build out from there? Or are you building out from, let's say, a shell and then kind of moving that shell in a 3D space? I mean, which process are you kind of referring to, if there is one?
A lot of the characters, especially the ones prior to Brave, were done where it's more like the shell is moving. We're looking at the final surface that the audience sees, and that's the thing that we're moving around most. So we're just making sure that it, aesthetically, it appeals to us. It looks natural. It looks right. And it's a lot of that comes with this, communication that's so necessary between different departments. And in that case, it's more about, the designers, the animators, and especially the modelers and articulators. But they have to basically put in controls. For instance, move an arm a certain way, see if the shoulder looks right as it kind of controls that transition from the torso. There's all kinds of subtler reactions that happen. Muscles are driving that movement, but the body as a whole might stretch as like an arm is raised. It'll stretch in a certain way. So the effect of movement can't just be isolated, to that one limb. It affects more of the body. And so anyway, that it mostly just has to simply be done, and it moves from one position to the next, and we evaluate whether or not it's convincing, whether or not it looks good, and go from there. But there are cases like on Brave where we started to, especially for the bear and the horse, we put the thing was designed first, and the shell of it is designed first, how we want that to look, and then we would build an internal skeleton that loosely mimicked what the real skeleton of a horse was. The loosely part is just simply we there's a lot of information there, so we cut out what isn't necessary, but we also simplify it so that the forms are easier to work with. And then we started laying muscle on top of the bones to see if we could drive some shapes on the surface from these internal forms. And it was really very effective on Brave. It added a nice complexity to the whole thing. And then there's even other layers of movement that are thrown in on top of all of that. This effect we call jiggle, which is just basically how a heavy muscle or a heavy part of the body might jiggle around, move around, like if the character stomped or jumped or landed hard. What secondary actions would come into play that would have nothing to do with a muscle driving a limb. It was just simply a reaction of the body's weight, to an external force or to the forces that are being generated by the movement itself. And you can animate that stuff, and we often do. We always make sure that the animators have control to make whatever changes they need. But what we've done a lot more as time has gone on is use simulations where once we figure out the parameters of a specific kind of movement or form change, we plug that stuff in, so it becomes kind of a physics that the forms will behave by. Okay. Same thing happens with cloth, actually, too. So and hair.
So sort of one thing I noticed from an audience point of view is, say, like a film like WALL-E, where you started introducing live action into the actual films. I can't remember the name of the actor, but he plays the dad out of Modern Family, of the son-in-law. I can't remember his name. Anyway,
it escapes me right now too. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, but so basically, how do you how have you seen and how do you see sort of like the digital animation side of things evolving? I mean, you mentioned things like simulation and stuff like that. You know, where do you see that sort of going as time goes on, and that merging between the real world or reality-based world and the worlds that you create at Pixar?
It's interesting. Pixar's path may go down a different path than the technology will. For other kinds of films, like effects that you might do in a live action film. Maybe I'll just start with Pixar's. I think that because we are always going to try to avoid a thing that you may have heard of. It's called the Uncanny Valley.
No, do tell. I've not. Do tell.
It's basically this idea that human perception is so detailed. And most of it is subconscious, that if you get too close to, like if you're trying to create a character and you get a little too close to a realistic looking human, then as that character starts to move, it can look very creepy to us, because the complexity of blood rushing under the skin, the amount of subsurface scattering that might happen because of light penetrating more translucent layers in your skin, little twitches, little bits of moisture, all of the things that are very natural to us, even changes in oil and I think I mentioned flushing, but it's so subtle that for instance, if you meet a friend and you notice that they're not looking well, and you ask them, how they're doing, because they're not feeling so good, and you pick up on a lot of subtle cues that'd be very hard to describe. And
like the puffiness, like the puffiness in the just kind of like subtle cues like puffiness in the face, or a red area that's kind of swelling, maybe in the nose, or those subtle cues.
Yeah, and all of these cues. If you can't match those exactly, and right now that level of complexity still hasn't been achieved, then the character kind of becomes repulsive. A lot of people say that it looks like an animated corpse, and so we kind of, the way Pixar looks at it is, we want to create characters that feel natural. But we are an animation studio, and we want them to be caricatured, and we look at it like, if we wanted to get extremely natural, to even close to that point, then why not just hire actors and film them? So, which would be much easier. So we're and more appealing. So, and it's not just because of that being easy. There's an art to animation, and we actually believe that a lot of times what we do can actually kind of create a connection and an emotion that's stronger than it would have been at least in the stories we're trying to tell. It'll be stronger than something that we might do with real actors, just because we can do those caricatures and we can touch people on a different level. There's been tests that have been done, and where you take a very, very simplified face, kind of like the just basically a circle with a line for a mouth and a couple of dots for eyes, and you can get people to see how that character emotes very easily, with a simple smile or whatever, and you can gradually increase the complexity all the way up to a very realistic photograph. But we play anywhere in between those two extremes. We just avoid the final realistic human. Mm-hmm. But if we're talking about other films that other studios that are doing live action films, I think we are going to see more and more stuff where the actors are being replicated in the computer, and like right now it's being used a lot for stunt work that would be impossible for a human to do, like Spider-Man. Uh-huh. And we're going to see more and more of that kind of thing happening. It was, I don't know if it was the first time it had ever been used, but it was certainly introduced in a big way in Lord of the Rings, where they would build these digital characters that could be seen from a distance, running across a bridge or whatever, and they'd be copies of the characters, but it made it possible to put them in a digital environment and also put them in safely. So sometimes an actor in front of a green screen is the way to do it, where you can composite that actor with whatever environment you want, digital or otherwise. But sometimes the stunts just need to be done with an animated computer figure, and so doing that kind of work is definitely going to continue, I think, to grow, and especially now we have a lot of much more complete things we can do where we can capture the actor's performance, the color of his face, like what you would see photographically anyway, and it can be projected onto the digital form, so that it's always going to look natural because it is actually an image from the actor himself.
Okay, well that's a great point to actually wrap up for part one of the show. But when we come back in part two, we'll be continuing to talk a little bit more about Pixar, and then we'll be going on to basically Paleo Mill and your work with dinosaurs. The Remotely Interested podcast is listener supported. You can support indirectly by following the links at remotely-interested.com, or you can support directly by becoming a sponsor of the show. If you would like to become a sponsor of the show, follow the links on the remotely-interested.com website. Hello, sticker lovers. StickerRobot.com is your place, your one go-to to basically get stickers for your business. Sticker Robot has done stickers for Google, they've done stickers for Facebook, they've even done stickers for Hot Wheels. If you need stickers for anything in any walk of life, go to StickerRobot.com.